Hello everyone, it's Kenny Burchard here. Welcome to the first ever episode of the MetaStory podcast. This is the podcast that's all about shaping a Christian worldview from the perspective of the big story, the meta story of the Bible. And as I said, this is the first episode, but it's also the first of a three-part introductory series. I'll be looking at a cluster of questions, 3 questions, that'll really form the basis for every future episode of this podcast. And right up front, those 3 questions are, first of all, what's a worldview? And we'll be looking at that question and unpacking it a bit in this episode. Second, what is Christianity? That'll be next time. And third, what's the Bible? And that question will round out the third episode in this introductory series. Today, we just want to give the contours of the first question. Now, as I just communicated in the introduction, this podcast will be an ongoing discussion of a Christian worldview from the perspective of the big story of the Bible. And just as you hear that sentence, you can notice the 3 primary questions emerge. And you have to ask, well, what do you mean, worldview? And what is Christianity? And exactly what is the Bible? And we have to ask those questions so that we can see how the ideas overlap. The way to do that is to get our terminology straight. So right out of the gate, I want to say what I mean by all of these words. And to begin, what do I mean when discussing the theme of worldviews? Question number 1, what's a worldview? My own definition is that a worldview is a comprehensive view of all reality. That's it. It's just a way of answering the biggest questions about life. And before we dig into that a little more, I just want to look at a couple more definitions. Someone's defined a worldview as a theory of the world that's used for living in the world. And I really like that because it embraces the idea of belief and how you live. Another definition is a worldview is a mental model of reality, a framework of ideas and attitudes about the world. Those are great. One of my favorite discussions of worldview comes from one of my favorite authors, theologians, and biblical scholars, and that's N.T. Wright. And in his great book, The New Testament and the People of God, N.T. Wright spills a lot of ink to discuss the theme of worldview. And he describes a worldview as, quote, talking about reality as a whole. That's excellent. He goes on to say that there are 4 primary things which worldviews characteristically do. And each of these together help to shape the worldview so that it can be glimpsed by others. First, he says that worldviews provide the stories through which human beings view reality. So if someone's talking to you about their worldview, they're going to tell you stories. But secondly, he says that it is from these stories that a person can, in principle, discover how to answer the basic questions, such as who are we and where are we and what's wrong and what's the solution, because those stories will deal with those questions. Third, he says that these stories express the worldview and the answers which it provides to the questions of identity and environment and evil and eschatology through cultural symbols, such as artifacts or events or festivals or family gatherings or things like that. You could call these things the life furniture, the things that people set up around themselves to tell you how they answer life's big questions based on the stories included in their worldview. But fourth, he says that a worldview really ultimately includes a praxis, or as he describes it, a way of being in the world. That is, simply put, your worldview is how you look at things, and it's how you answer the big questions of life, and ultimately, it's how you live in the world. And everyone has a worldview. Everyone. And so, for the sake of putting together something that we can put handles on, I want to propose for the next part of this episode 5 primary elements that will be common and present in any coherent worldview. Now, the first element in a coherent worldview is the element of knowledge. And this is where we ask the question, what do we know? And how do we know it? In fact, how do we know anything at all? And how do we know that we know what we know? Another way of asking the question is this: how can I know anything? And how can I say that what I know is actually true? The question of knowledge may also ask if there's anything that's more true than something else, or if everything that I now see and understand is all there is to see and understand. Related to this, though, is another question in the truth and knowledge category of a worldview. And that is this: is being sure or certain about something the same thing as knowing it? And is it the same thing as truth? Does what I feel sure about mean that what I feel sure about is actually true? Every worldview has some kind of basis by which truth and knowledge about reality are evaluated. But the second element in any coherent worldview is the element of origins. And this is where we ask and answer the questions like, where did we come from? Why do we exist? This is an attempt to account for our own existence and how that existence came about. Without even talking about this from a theological perspective, if you sit down with the average person you know and you ask them where they think we come from, chances are good they'll have some kind of answer. And that's because they have a worldview, whether they know it or not. Some kind of view that answers the question of origin. Every worldview includes some kind of attempt to answer this question. Now, the third element in a coherent worldview is the element of conditions. And the questions within this element of conditions are questions like, are things in the world going the way they should be going, or are there problems? Maybe more simply put, is anything wrong with the world? And if so, what is it? Now, this part of a worldview is an attempt to account for what we see as problems in the world that we live in. And again, without even talking about this from a theological perspective, if you were to ask the average person you know what they think is wrong with the world, chances are good that they'll have an answer to this as well. And again, that's because everyone, whether they know it or not, has a worldview, which always includes some kind of attempt to answer the problems question or the conditions question. Now, the fourth element in a coherent worldview is very much related to this, and that's the element of solutions. That is, every worldview attempts to answer the question, is there any way to make the world what it's supposed to be? Is there any way to fix these problems that we identified? A shorter way of putting it would be, how do we fix what's wrong with the world? And again, as with the previous elements, you don't have to talk about theology with anyone when discussing this important question. Whether a person claims to believe in God or not, chances are good that they've thought about what's wrong with the world. And they've thought about what it would take to make the world a better place. I would even say chances are high that they may already be engaged in putting their worldview into practice by trying to fix things along the lines of how they believe things get fixed. That's what people do. Let's call the fifth element present in any coherent worldview the element of resolution. And that's where we talk about the future. That is, every coherent worldview attempts to answer the questions, well, where is everything headed? And what's going to happen to the world? These are the really big questions of life, aren't they? And they're not only religious questions. They're not just questions for religious people. These are everyone's questions. They're the questions that everyone, religious or not, is asking and attempting to answer. And as N.T. Wright correctly suggests, a worldview really takes off when a person begins to put the way they think about things into practice. And so all around us are people living out the answers as they understand them to life's big questions. What do we know, and how can we know that we know it, and where do we come from, and what's the purpose of life, and what's wrong with the world, and how can we fix it and make the world what it's supposed to be, and where's everything going, and what does the future hold? Now, since worldview will always be a central component of everything we discuss on this podcast, we'll have to come back to it over and over. So for now, I just want to leave what I've said so far right where it is. And in the next episode, I'll move to the next question: what is Christianity? As you prepare for that discussion, I want to ask you to take a moment and write down what you believe the best answer to the question, what is Christianity, really is. And be ready to think about your answer with me when we're together again. I do want to thank you for joining me on this first episode of the MetaStory, and I look forward to being with you again as we look together at a Christian view of the world through the lens of the Bible's grand narrative, the MetaStory. You can follow me on Twitter at Kenny Burchard, as well as on Facebook.com/Kenny Burchard. No hyphens or spaces in that. I'm also a primary contributor at thinktheology.org, and who knows, if you Google me, you might even find me in a few other places too. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to being with you again soon.